Can you start by telling us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Todd Moore, IBM's Vice President for Open Technology and Open Source. I'm also the Node.js board chairperson, so I have a deep heart for Node.js here.
That's really exciting. I know IBM has been a big contributor to Node over the years. One thing that's been in the news recently is that IBM has decided to acquire Red Hat. Can you talk a little bit about why you're excited about that and what you think it means for the community?
Yeah, actually, I'm very excited about it, and it's because for over 2 decades we've worked side by side with Red Hat folks in open source. It's something that's in IBM's DNA just as it is in Red Hat's, and from the very early days of open source to when we made a very large investment in Linux, $1 billion investment in Linux, and pledged to not assert our patents against Linux. That really kicked things off in terms of making open source accessible to enterprises. And then that just continued. It snowballed because we saw the benefit of what power open source could bring to the world. And so think of Apache Software Foundation, all the work that went on there, the great work that was done in Eclipse. IBM seeded Eclipse with $30 million worth of software, which back then was a lot of money. And then all the other open source foundations and work that we've done along the way, OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, putting together the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the work that we did with Hyperledger, bringing that out, taking the work that was going on in blockchain and IBM and open sourcing that and basically working with the Linux Foundation to bootstrap that up into something that's really a super foundation that's going on there. So we're happy because this is what we do, is what they do. Our people are engaged in open source all the time, and it just feels right. And it's a pivotal point in what's going on in hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. About 20% of folks have figured out that how to get into cloud. They're making their first steps oftentimes, but they're getting engaged in cloud. There's another 80% that's still left to go, and about $1 trillion worth of business we think that sits there that will over time hopefully have a really good chance of capturing a lot of that, and there's a lot of value that comes with it. And I'm also excited for developers, because in my role in being in charge of open source at IBM, I go and talk to clients week in and week out, and multiple conversations usually a week where they're struggling with how do I consume open source often first, and then how do I contribute to it as well too, and what kind of program can I set up internally in my company to go and do what you've done in IBM. And their developers are oftentimes fighting internally to get the ability to be able to go out and either use a piece of open source code or contribute. And by us now placing an even bigger bet on open source very publicly for quite a bit of money, it makes it much easier for them to point to that and say, hey, if they're doing it and they're all in, we should be doing this as well too. So I think it's helping them as well. I've already seen notes, and I've had people stop me in hallways and things thanking us for being part of this and going and doing it, because they think that's going to make their lives easier in their companies now.
So you just mentioned about the value that open source brings to enterprise. Me working at Microsoft on open source, you at IBM on open source. I think we inherently know the value that enterprise brings to open source and vice versa. But can you kind of talk a little bit for everyone else about why enterprise is valuable to open source and why open source is valuable to enterprise?
So enterprises really contribute quite a bit of the resource that goes into open source these days. There are still many individual contributors who come and participate in projects, but oftentimes what you'll find is that it's folks from enterprises and the large vendors as well too, who are in there working day in and day out as the volunteers, making things work in open source. There's bills to be paid, there's things to be done, there's infrastructure to set up, and that takes effort, people, money. investment in that. So it's good for the community because they get the resources that they need to go and do the things they want to do. In Node.js, as an example, we provide access to funds for people to travel. So we spent $75,000 this last year on just travel reimbursement for people who normally wouldn't have been able to get out to an event or be part of something to help the community go and say drive change, make, whatever project come together in the community, but suddenly they have access to funds now to be able to go and do that. So it's things like that we're giving to the community, and the community is benefiting from it as well. That really make a difference, and it's the good part of open source. We've learned as an industry now that we don't need to compete on plumbing. That we can work together, we can create de facto standards in the open source code that we have, and as a result of that then compete above, around, through the services, other things on that base, but at least create the interoperability to protect the user from vendor lock-in, those types of things that they're looking for. And so the client sees that it's much safer to go and get engaged and use the open source because they get freedom of action, and all of the vendors then get to go and work collaboratively to create the standards, as opposed to sitting down and writing some spec and then hoping everybody's implementation sort of matches that. The other thing that we feel really strongly about is open governance. That was actually one of the things that is, I think, most similar about us and Red Hat, is that we want to see projects be truly open, not just open and I slapped an open source license on it, but actually be out there and have the ability for any contributor to work their way to actually be a maintainer, to be able to commit the code, to be part of it and be able to make part of the decisions actually happen within it as well too. Oftentimes we'll see single vendor things happen out there that they really control everything that's going on, and that's not the way to have good community and have very long-lived projects. So we're very much for truly open sourcing what goes on out there and working collaboratively out in the open.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. At Microsoft, we have a very similar philosophy, and it seems to be benefiting both of us. And so one thing you mentioned specifically in which you give back is by providing travel funds for people to go to events. There are a number of IBM employees here at NodeConf EU, yourself included, as well as a few speakers. Can you talk a little bit about why you think it's important for large enterprises to get involved in conferences like NodeConf EU and the value that NodeConf EU brings to IBM?
Yeah, so NodeConf is a small event. It's not very large, but it's actually interestingly structured. We're out in sort of the middle of an area where there's not a lot around. It brings the developers together. It's a little harder to get here. You truly got to want to be here, and it's quite a few days to actually engage in it. But it allows people the social interaction with the leaders of the community to be able to sit down, ask questions, and understand quite a bit more about what's going on inside Node, as well as how to apply Node and some of the changes and things that are happening. And it's a nice venue here in Europe to go and do that. As the Node Foundation, I'll put on that hat, not necessarily the IBM hat, but as a Node Foundation, we had been doing many events across the world, and the staff, really got run down by doing that. It's hard. So we focused on having a single event that we ran out of Vancouver this year, and actually did that jointly with the JS Foundation. We've announced actually an intent at that event, an intent to merge the two foundations together, and we're working through that right now. We actually held a session here in NodeConf to just work with community members, get their feedback, understand what they really found important and what they needed. So it's a nice event. It's in Europe. It's small. People are very accessible. Leaders like Michael Dawson from our team, who is the head of the technical steering committee for Node.js, James Snell from Nearform, who has just been tirelessly working in there, also working on HTTP2 for a while, finally came out with that. So you get to see that, and it's attracted good folks from the Chrome team out here talking about V8, and the changes that have happened in there. So it's a really nice event for people to get engaged in. And from our perspective, we get a lot of people to our booth to come and see and talk to us and learn the things that we're doing about Node. And this is the event really in Europe right now for the team to participate in and get to interact with our clients as well too. So it's good for us.
All right, and the last question I have for you is, if there's one piece of advice you could give to other companies who want to get involved in open source, what piece of advice would you give?
So, yeah, I get this question actually quite a bit, and there's a whole list of pieces of advice that I have. So it's hard to nail it down to one. I think the first thing is to overcome your fear of getting out there and being part of open source. That the licensing and the work that's been done to make it safe to participate is really important to look at. And if you work with projects that are in particular licensed, say with the Apache version 2 license or the MIT license, etc., that you're relatively safe in what you're going to go and do and can maybe contribute to or consume. And your people need to get in there and start small, make small contributions. I call it chopping wood, carrying water, CW, but get out and make small contributions, become involved, work with one of the main contributors, say in a project who's got something going on, to help them. That'll help get your work recognized and get you to the point where you can then get to contributor, maintainer, whatever that project calls itself, for you're the guys who are in charge, putting the code in there. So start small, work your way up, and don't be afraid. It's a lot of fun, and there's a lot of good people in the community to go and work with who will take the time to work with you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Todd.
Thank you.